and then we'll begin the presentation. So Edward Jacobs is currently employed by the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office as the Director of Grants and Sponsored Projects, having been in a position since 1998. He is responsible for grant writing and administration, as well as community education and special projects, having administered over $14 million in grant funding since 2000. Prior to working at the District Attorney's Office, he was a probation officer for 13 years at the Brockton District Court supervising juvenile offenders and mental health adults. He also served 7 years as the director of DYS Detention Center. He holds a master's degree of clinical social work from Boston College and has 42 years experience in the juvenile justice and forensic mental health field. He completed his clinical training at McLean Hospital with his concentration on addictions and adolescent behavior health. He serves on the faculty at Bridgewater State University, Curry College, and Stonehill College, as located in Massachusetts. Mr. Jacobs has presented at numerous local and statewide conferences. His national speaking engagements are as follows, and I'll just read a couple of them. The Massachusetts Bar Association, the National Crime Prevention, the National Weed and Seed Conference, the U.S. Attorney of West Virginia Department of Education, and it goes on and on. He is going to be talking about ACEs, and we are very excited to have him. So welcome, Edward.
Thank you very much. You can hear me all right, I assume? Is that all right?
Yes.
Good, great. So, so I'm Ed Jacobs, and I'm here to kind of tell you that I am going to give you it from the field point of view. I think you'll realize that you're probably a lot smarter than I am. And so I'm going to give you what I've experienced over the last 42 years and how we've evolved into some community responses. We've been working mainly in Plymouth County, but we've been in Worcester County, other parts of Massachusetts, Connecticut, West Virginia, Florida. And when Jackie asked me to speak down at your down in Nantucket, I always wanted to go, but it seemed like Thursdays was always class day. I have classes on Thursday night, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm hoping that I'm going to fly through some slides. Forgive me for death by PowerPoint if I talk fast. I've had about 3 cups of coffee. The heat in my place isn't working, so I brought a hat just in case and my heavy sweater. But he's working on it now, so hopefully you don't hear pounding. So let's, as we say, get into it if we can. And so some of you may be familiar with this book on the right-hand side. That's Betsy Mcallister Groves' book. That was a kind of a watershed book for me. It was the aha moment, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. The precipitating incident was one where I was at the district attorney's office in '98, and I had been a PO, as you said, and worked in DYS as a school teacher and then director of a detention center. And I got to the DA's office, and we weren't putting out fires like you are at the court every day doing crisis. I said, so to a lot of people in the community, so where's the plan? And they said, what plan? I said, the plan to address, juvenile delinquency and gangs and the needs of kids and mental illness. And it became clear to me there was no plan. So as we were struggling, or I was struggling to either find a plan or develop a plan, et cetera, I got a phone call from a gentleman who's a mentor of mine, Ed Olson. He's a school adjustment counselor in Brockton. And he called me on a Tuesday, and he said, Eddie, last Thursday night, there was an armed home invasion at such and such a street. And I said, well, hang on, give me the number and I'll call you right back. And I did. I went down to the state troopers and I said, you got anything on this armed home invasion? They said, yeah, it's a drug house ripoff. They gave me the folder or the file, the police report. And I went down and talked to Ed. And what happened in the police report is that it was a drug house ripoff. So one set of drug dealers is looking at another set of drug dealers to steal from each other because you're not going to call the cops. Well, the problem was in this 3-story house, instead of getting the 3rd floor where the drug dealers were, they got the 2nd floor where there was a mom, a 12-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 6-year-old. They kick in the door, they're masked, they pistol whip the mom. The 12-year-old boy tries to protect his mother. He gets a gun in his mouth. There's a 5- and 6-year-old boy and girl in the back room, crying, acting out, as you can imagine, just kind of screaming. It's a nightmare show. They leave, they realizing they're in the wrong place. The door is off the hinges at this point. The police come, take the pictures, but they get everybody to the emergency room. And at 3:30 in the morning, they get back to the apartment. And God love the mother, she tries to duct tape the door because who's going to fix her door at 3 o'clock in the morning? No one. Well, about 15 minutes later, she gets a knock on the door, and it's from two detectives who said, "We have some clothing. Can you come outside? We want to show you." So the 12-year-old boy and the mother at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning go outside on the street and do what they had to do. And Ed said to me, "Now, Ed, now it's Thursday. Now it's Friday morning early." He said the next day, the 12-year-old, the 5-year-old, and the 6-year-old came to school, and they came on time. And he said, and there was no one in our school who knew one thing that had happened to them, had no idea. So I began to try to imagine myself when I was that age. And I think when I was that age, I had kind of that magical thinking, like if something was going on in my world, I thought all the adults knew. In this case, they didn't. And so now I began to think, well, if I'm that child and I walk into that school and no one says a word to me, what are the messages that I might get? Well, one of them might be, well, I guess they don't care. The other message might be, I guess this is my new normal, or I guess this is no big deal, or any one of a number of ones. But the point is that all of which I would consider toxic in regards to developing the relationship between the child and the children at school. And when I said to Ed, geez, it doesn't get any worse than that, does it? He said, no, it gets worse. I said, how is that? He said, one of the 12-year-old mentioned to one of his friends in his class what had happened to him, that he had a gun in his mouth the night before. He said, but before the school day was over, the rumor mill had got back to the main office that he has a gun in his locker. So they brought the dogs in and they brought the police in, and it was a mess. And Ed said, how can we be caring adults in these kids' lives if we don't know what's going on? And I thought, fair question. So now I was writing grants. I was working on Weed and Seed and some other grants coming up that I'll mention. But we had some money to do some data collection. So I asked a researcher to take just Brockton at this point, 6 months worth of Brockton Police Department police reports on violent events and how many kids were in them for the last 6 months and then the coming 6 months. So after 6 months, I had a year's worth of data. And what I found was that children were mentioned inside of police reports. So Brockton's 100,000, as you know, people approximately. 17,800 kids in the school system, fourth largest in Massachusetts. And we had 800 incidences of kids being in the police report. And that was for something that was of a violent nature. Someone was arrested, etc. So it was community violence, domestic violence, mainly. When I went and did a focus group with the police officers with that, they said, we don't always put the kids in the police report because we don't want them to testify, or they said they didn't hear anything, et cetera, et cetera. And we tried to tell them what we were trying to uncover. And the next year we had 1,400 incidences. So we knew we had to do something. We knew that the data was compelling. People were saying, oh, we're already addressing this. We have at my counseling agency, we work with kids who witness violence. And I said, oh, that's great. How many you got? Well, we have one group right now. We have 8 kids in it. I said, well, I don't know if that's going to get it. We needed a much larger, more comprehensive. So Betsy Mcallister's book was one that had kind of rang true to me, because when I was working in detention, I can remember a moment in my life, I'll never forget it. We had a young man who was, as they say, going off. He was being abusive to himself and going after other people and needed to be, restrained in an appropriate way. But there were 3 guys my size who were trying to contain him, and he had so much rage for 20 minutes. I don't know if I've ever seen anything like it. I hadn't seen anything like it. It scared me, frankly. So where does that come from? I read her book, and then it began to make some sense. So we did some research on best practices, went down to looked at the work that she was doing at the Boston Medical Center, OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, had some work done. Went down and spent 2 nights at the Yale New Haven. Yale uses their graduate students to do ride-alongs with police officers. We went down on 2 different occasions, and now Brockton has been doing that for about 15 years, where they have a social worker riding with a police officer. I'm going to fly through these. The leg of the stool that we really needed, quite frankly, that we were doing our training on, was we found in 2006, we found a book called Helping Traumatized Children Learn. You might be aware of it, Joe Restuccia, Susan Cole. That's out of Mass Advocates, out of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. They're out of Harvard Law. This became the third leg of the stool. This was really something that could help us, because we were going to schools and talking to them about the numbers we were seeing and how can we help them with trauma and how can we help them deal with it. And for the most part, every single school system said to me, listen, you got to talk to Sally and Bob because they did training at the Cape or in the Berkshires last summer, and they're certified trauma. They're going to do the trauma, therapists, and we send all our kids who have issues to them. And I thought, well, okay, how many kids you got in the school? And they said 900, 400, whatever. And I thought, well, given the numbers I just heard, so we really needed to do, one of the things I really like about this book, and we can get into a little bit later, but is that it's a whole school approach. So when we do trainings, we've got about 10,000 educators since 2005, about 3,000 police officers training. We want teachers, we want paraprofessionals, we want cafeteria people, we want janitors, we want bus drivers if we can get them, and substitute teachers, because everybody needs to be part of the solution to this issue. So just quickly, we talk about the brain development, and we started to look at the numbers in regards to our police reports. You can see here that we had a significant number of kids, pretty young. And so in terms of brain development, and I'm going to move through some of these. So Brockton does about 1,550, 1,600 domestic violence calls annually. Officer, I don't know how many Nantucket does, but when you looked at Brockton, you said, oh, gee, that's Brockton. Okay, 1,600. Well, we do a lot of work with Plymouth. Plymouth is America's hometown, 50,000 people, and they had 800. So kind of ratio-wise, about the same. And so we started to think, well, how many of those have kids in the house? And again, you can see from domestic violence restraining orders, more than half. We looked at the time of day, the calls, and again, what you see is that's the 4 p.m. to midnight or 8 p.m. to midnight, kids are home. This is a map we use when we do trainings with schools. So this happens to be Brockton, but I've done this with Plymouth. I've done it with Charleston, West Virginia, or other places. We get some crime mapping. What we want to do is kind of look for patterns. So this is narcotics arrests in the city. This is over an 8-month period. Can you kind of see a pattern there? You can kind of see from 12 to 6, seems to be a kind of a scatter. This is a heat map, a little more recent. In our office, we can literally then, when we have it internet connected, we can take that heat map and spread it out. We can start to tell you how many incidents happen on what street corner or what number house, et cetera. It helps us kind of focus on where our resources might go. Again, another scatter of crime. But you see, I hope, the scatter. And again, please stop me with any questions. Just jump right in. And so what's this? So this is the number of kids who were in the juvenile court in Brockton over a 4-year period. You can see the legend where they had from 1 arraignment to 5, but again, you see the scatter. So where these kids are living is what they're, is a direct correlation. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So that's Brockton. And then I had so many of our towns say, yeah, but that doesn't happen here. Well, I got news for you. More of our affluent towns, if you talk to advocates, if you talk to victims, if you talk to police, they're going to tell you that in regards to domestic violence and even overdoses, affluent people can cover that up a lot better than some in other places. So this is what happened in Plymouth County and in Bristol County and Dukes County. And again, this, again, the opioid epidemic is all too frequent. So we were originally working with kids for domestic violence and community violence. But by 2010 and 12, things got to be pretty clear that something was going on. And again, you can see this kind of rise, and that only goes to 2014. Massachusetts right now, there's 2,000 overdoses annually, thereabouts. And again, you can see by county that if you looked at Plymouth County, Bristol County, and Barnstable, and I did the numbers back in 2015, compare in terms of per 100,000 opioid deaths and opioid overdoses documented, the numbers in this part of the world were every bit like Southern Ohio and West Virginia. So here you can see just Plymouth County unattended deaths. That means that, again, wasn't in a medical facility, wasn't in an emergency room, was someplace else. And local police come and then they get turned over to our office for an investigation by our state troopers to determine cause of death. And so this is just opioid overdose unattended deaths. But I want you to look at 2013. You can see that it was 42. And 1 year later it was 77. And a year after that, there was 142. So in 2 years, we almost tripled, probably more. Obviously a problem. Again, we like maps. I like maps, visual learner. I want to know what's going on. And this has been eye-opening for a lot of chiefs and a lot of other folks. You can certainly see a lot of scatter up in Brockton. That's pretty clear. You know, it's off of Route 24. But interestingly, Brockton will have about 900 to 1,000 opioid overdoses annually. They'll have a number, about 100 plus people will in that range, or little, say 80 to 90 will aspire. But 51% of the people who overdose in Brockton are not from Brockton. They're from another part of the county. So you can see that there are pockets in certain places that we have issues. And I say, well, gee, look at the part of Plymouth that's good. Well, that's the state forest. Nobody's in there. So we wanted to take a look that year of 2015. Where did these deaths happen? Because originally somebody would say, well, I theorize it's in a Burger King parking lot or a Dunkin' Donuts restroom. Now, 65% happen in a home.
Mm.
Who else lives in homes? Kids. So when I first got into this, and I remember being at the mentioned McLean Hospital, when I was working there, I heard that people who overdosed, particularly in heroin back in the day, this is 25 years ago, 30 years ago, if you will, were in their 40s and 50s, et cetera, because their body was starting to break down. Like they would be in recovery, and then they would relapse, and then they would take, injection, a hot shot, if you will. And so that seemed to be, but with the oxycodone piece, we had a lot more people doing opioids in a much earlier period, as you know. And so here you see that 68% of the people who expired were between the ages of 20 and 39. I would call that prime time, parent time. Now, the thing about this is, what we got to realize is, and I'm sure you do, is that's the tip of the pyramid, right? Death is obviously the tip of the pyramid. How many people overdose? Well, in Plymouth County, it's another 2,000. Well, how many people are using in front of their kids? Well, what's that number? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it became obvious to us that we needed some kind of strategy. Again, this was a homicide of a young girl who was literally 4 years old, and came across some of her mother and father's works, and the parents thought it was a good idea to put a little bit of heroin in her milk to settle her down. She had been born neonatal abstinence syndrome, or addicted to opioids. So as we started to go to schools, some of the folks I work with at High Point, we had a contract with them. I came back one day and I said, geez, I had this interesting conversation with the school principal, elementary school. I said, we could come in and help you do some training and want to identify, what's going on. And the principal said, Ed, we're like K through 6. Like our kids don't do drugs. And that wasn't the point though. And again, here's another one. This is part of a photo voice. I don't know if you're familiar with that. We can talk about it if you like later. But this is actually getting kids to take these pictures, and then they brainstorm together as to how they'll be set up. So we've used a lot of these, the one you saw before, and this one for billboards, et cetera. No break. Okay. So this is just part of the Childhood Trauma Initiative. This is just some of the things and people we've partnered with in regards to our training and getting the word out. We see kind of 3 pieces. One is raise awareness, get everyone to understand it, not just the practitioners. And then the next piece is, can we prime the pump on a number of interventions that we can use? So whether it's, and you might be familiar with Calmer Choice, we use them, or Balance for Kids, or Drug Story Theater, or whatever it might be, but to try to get that into the community, et cetera. Again, another example. And then that last piece for us is using the try to get policy change. We can talk about that. So again, I'm sure you're familiar with the ACEs study. This became by 2008 or 9. This study was already 10 or 11 years old, but boy, it became something that we built almost everything we were doing in regards to this. It became everything we did. It was like an underlying, almost like a spine, if you will. And again, you can see, the numbers better than I. And again, I think I got the wrong, I think I have my wrong PowerPoint, but we're going to move through these quick. Again, 10-year-old boy. This is Dr. Martin Titcher out of McLean. This is a 10-year-old boy with no history of trauma, and another 10-year-old boy with a significant history of trauma. And he's lit up, as you can see. So as we talk about the risks, and if you would just give me a second, I'm going to go to find the slideshow I would like to get to, if you can let me do that. That's Nantucket. My apologies. Can you see the Nantucket one, the February 18th? Is that showing up for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, my fault. It's really my fault. Apologize. Okay. All right, so I'm going to work with this as best I can. So these are the slides we would use for training with teachers, faith-based communities. We do a lot of training with police officers. One of the things we just did, Dr. Dan Muse is a physician at the hospital in Brockton. He's also the medical director for a number of police departments and fire departments. He said, hey, would you do this ACEs training you did, because he saw that we did it with schools and police, and he said, would you do it for firefighters? So in early December, we did for 350 firefighters on a Zoom, and from that, I got 7 departments that came back and said, hey, where you been? My guys need this, or my men and women need this, because we're going to calls all the time, and as you said, we don't have those tools in our tool belt. So we wanted to also bring the awareness of the impact on learning. So we thought an extra set of eyes and ears. Let's get every teacher to understand, at least minimally, what's going on with trauma, what's going on with their kids, what are they seeing? Because we wanted to change the idea of, oh, that looks like ADHD behavior, to abuse reactive or PTSD or whatever it might be. So again, we fell back on the work and the research done by TLPI and the Help and Traumatized Children Learn book. And again, so we do this training and try to get schools to understand what kind of behavior they're seeing and have them go, yeah, we know that kid, we know that kid. The one here that I always mention, and I will with you too, is it's the perfectionism. It's that child who, the kid who kind of tells me to, pardon my French, F off or get in my face, or they go off. Boy, something's going on, right? But with that child who stays below the radar, they've either been coached up or they figured it out. Don't draw any attention to myself or to my family. That would not be good. And so they stay literally under the radar. Again, it affects relationships, and this is thing, and I can give you these slides. I trimmed some of these down. Dangers everywhere, must be vigilant. The school's thing is, he won't pay attention, just won't try hard enough. If I'm perfect, I'll protect myself and my parents. She's such a good kid, she doesn't need help. I always have to be in control so that I can avoid danger. And again, she's defiant, aggressive, a bad kid. And I can't trust that you have my best interests at heart. So many kids feel like that sometimes. He rejects any help that I offer him. So this is counterproductive to the relationship building at schools, obviously. And again, these are the 4 domains for success as put in by TLPI and based on their research originally from the work that Professor Vanderkook did, the Trauma Center with ARC, if you're familiar with that. They added some pieces here. So again, TLPI is one that I think is really important for us. That was the 3rd leg of the stool. We were trying to get schools to understand. We were trying to get police and first responders to understand, but we needed some kind of methodology, some kind of philosophy, some kind of, and I don't want to say a program. We needed to get people to change the mindset instead of yelling at kids and getting upset with them and saying, hey, what's wrong with you? We wanted to change the paradigm to what's happened to you. So this was helpful to us in so many ways. And again, I'm just going to kind of move through. This is what happened before at a police call. They would go to a house. The police would respond. There'd be maybe a 51A would file. They'd find a report. The police would leave. Again, the child goes to school the next day, and there's disruptive behavior, or the child's in the back of the room, or the teacher's saying, Johnny, where's your homework? Why don't you have your homework today? So we try to, this is something we do with police officers. How do we get them to put, so many officers, they're great, but they'll say, Ed, I'm not a social worker, and I'm like, yeah, you are, but that's a story for another day. We can discuss that. In the meantime, we need to give you some tools to put in your tool belt so that when you go to a scene and there's a crisis, you're not just going to secure the scene, you're going to try to address the needs of those kids. I got to tell you, I've heard this probably a dozen times of this ilk with police officers when I've done the training. We go to the house, we quell the scene, there's an overdose, Narcan's administered, or mom goes to the hospital, there's a domestic violence, we get the father out of the house, and I look over in the corner and there's a 5-year-old boy and he's sucking his thumb and he's rocking back and forth. And I don't know what to do for that. And so we need to help police address that issue. We all do. So in 2012 or 13, we were asked to go down and speak at West Virginia, the U.S. Attorney, and then later, about 6 months later, with the Department of Education. And so in the TLPI book, Help and Traumatized Children Learn book, there's a strategy in there called the red envelope. And that red envelope means that if something happens last night, Eddie Jacobs' father beats up his mother, the father's arrested, all what happens is the officer puts my name down on a piece of paper, goes into a red envelope, went on the teacher's desk, and now the teacher had a heads up. Well, we thought that was a strategy that could work pretty well. When we went down to West Virginia, they decided to take it statewide. And the other thing they did, they called us and said, do you mind if we change the name from red envelope to handle with care? And I thought that was brilliant because it spoke to exactly what we're trying to do. Now, as we get into this, I want to let you know that, again, so we have a Handle with Care website, Massachusetts, that you can go on. And again, we'll talk about Handle with Care. This is basically the form. It's the child's name and the date. That's it. You don't know, and the police officer doesn't know. The police officer does not tell it was an overdose. No. It was domestic violence. No. The 6-year-old, the dog got out of the house and got hit by a car. Nope. Grammy, who's been another case, we had Grammy's been living in the house for 13 years and aspires in the middle of the night, natural causes, has a heart attack, but the children are there and pretty upset. And the police respond. So again, there's a key piece on this. One is we need to train the officers to look for it. And then we need to work with the schools. So we do a lot of training with schools. We do a 2-hour, 4-hour, 8-hour training, depending on what they're looking for. And we really want to let them know that, there are strategies they can use and they're outlined in the book, et cetera. And the book, by the way, is free online. You can buy the hard copy, but everything's free, which is always good. And the thing is that we wanted to also change that idea of schools saying, well, okay, but something happened to the child, but can't you tell me what happened? No, we can't, and we're not gonna. So you're gonna have to live with it. So we see this piece of, if we train everybody in the school, primary prevention, everybody gets a dose of what does it look like? What is it? What might I be, when will I know when I see it? The next one is that secondary prevention. I see some symptomology. I see some difficulty here. How might I address that in a more way? And then we had the tertiary piece, which was how do we share information between the school and the police and the school? And again, we have a kind of an MOU that we're willing to share. We're happy to do all this. And this would change that paradigm of the child witness to violence into the police follow-up. And then there's a police screen the reports, they contact the school. Sometimes we do in some cases, depending on the city, we do a social worker ride along. And again, there's a Handle with Care. And then we work with the schools to connect with services. Plymouth County Outreach, and I'm kind of trying to finish on this one. Plymouth County Outreach is, it was started by the Plymouth Police Chief and the East Bridgewater Chief and about 3 or 4 other ones. We had given them some dollars. We were interested in the idea of what they were doing about 6 years ago, which they wanted to change the paradigm of let's go to the scene, let's administer Narcan, and then be on our way. And then they were starting to say, we're going to the same houses or same places a number of times. And a number of the chiefs came to the conclusion that we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. We're not going to investigate our way out of this problem. So we need to come to a different, a different paradigm. They asked us for some money to develop some training and then also to develop a database. And so here's how it works in Plymouth County. You may be aware if you're not. But all the chiefs in Plymouth County, the 27 towns plus Bridgewater State University, all the chiefs signed an MOU. Now, I don't know you, but my experience with law enforcement and particularly chiefs of police, great folk, but you can't get them to agree on wearing blue the same day, let alone sign an MOU, but they did it. In that, it's like, so here's essentially what would happen is, there's an overdose call. If it's fatal, there's no follow-up, obviously. If it's non-fatal, there's an overdose. They go to the minister, Narcan would be administered, person's going to the hospital. that the town where that person has overdosed is going to go into the database and say, Ed Jacobs from Brockton overdosed in Plymouth. They're going to punch that in. Brockton's going to be aware of that I've overdosed. At which point we have agreements with the hospitals and MOUs with them as well. And then the hospital is then going to try to get that person, obviously take care of them, their initial needs, and try to take care of what they do in terms of stabilizing them. But they're going to try to use recovery coaches to get them into treatment at that time. A lot of people won't go. So if they do decide to go, I want to go to treatment, Gosnell, High Point, whatever, then the hospital is literally put in no follow-up requested. And then if they say follow-up requested, that means the person has turned it down. So since they started this, the police officers and the certified recovery coaches, they've probably gone to over 2,000 houses, never been asked to leave a house, never had a confrontation, and they probably placed about 600 to 700 individuals in treatment. Even when they go to the house and the individual isn't there, many times what we've been finding is the idea of, and this is a program I'm working on now, which is drug endangered children, and that is they're following up with the other parent, or in many cases the grandparents raising grandkids, and that's been it. So we give that information to whoever's their friend, colleague, whatever, grandparent, and a lot of times if the person says no initially on that visit, there's been so many occasions where the police would come back and say, he said no 2 weeks ago, but now he wants to go in. And they're going to get him into a bed. If you told me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that we were going to have police officers buying an individual with substance use disorder lunch on the way to driving them to a rehab center, I would say, I don't think that's happening. But in fact, it is. This is just a quick example of the database and who does the follow-up and when is it due. And again, these cases can't be cleared until there's a follow-up of all of these things. So everything has to be, there's a follow-up, you can see in that right-hand side, et cetera. Obviously, the names of the SUD individuals have been removed. We can break it down and cut it into a number of different ways, or they can. Follow-up reports, has it been before? One of the things that the chiefs got a lot of calls on from parents was, parents said, you got this PCO, I heard about it, but does my son or daughter have to overdose before you can do an intervention or you can offer some assistance? Mm-hmm. They kind of went, no. So they have about 130 individuals that they stop by, they visit, they come in, et cetera. I'm not ready yet, but when I'm ready, I'll let you know. And they placed quite a few of those folks. It's just a study that we liked in regards to this idea of the ripple effect. Even if we stopped the opioid epidemic today, the effects of what's happened to our kids and our families is, it's going to take a while. Ripples into the future, if you will. Just lastly, in regards to the ACEs, we took a look again. When we go into a community, some people will say, "Well, we're pretty good, and we're pretty affluent. We're this, we're that." And I say, "Okay, well, so let's just take a look at what we can find in terms of community ACEs: number of 51As, number of overdoses, number of reported abuse and neglect." Again, as many things as we can find in regards to what's going on. Now, you have a special, unique situation in Nantucket, but I dare say, and maybe I'm wrong, and you can correct me, but if you scratch, a little bit beneath the surface, I think you might see some of these. Now, these are kids who are before the juvenile courts, and you can see the number of ACEs. So again, the ACEs study was not to determine the number of kids who had witnessed. It was for people who are in their 50s and 60s year old who said, "Did you have any of these ACEs? And if you did, then it was with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, and then they took a look at their medical records and said, dose response: the more ACEs you have, higher rates of cancer. More ACEs you have, higher rates of alcoholism or substance use. More ACEs you have, heart disease, ischemic, high blood pressure, et cetera. 7 or more ACEs, you cut down your life expectancy by 15 to 20 years. So that's what this came about. This came from Judge Spinelli over at Bristol Court. And again, you can see based on boys and girls, but these numbers for juvenile court play right into what was also called the ACEs study, or the Philadelphia ACEs study. Remember, the first ACEs study was 18,000 individuals, 75% white, 70% college educated. So it wasn't those people. And yet the numbers for those ACEs were pretty high. The Philadelphia study took place in the inner city, and it was a lot like these numbers. And again, you know the national data about kids in foster care, and as well as the care and protections. You can see this is Plymouth, Bristol. I should have pulled Dukes, but if you look at 12, Plymouth County had 110. Now we have 165. At one point, they had 200. Again, termination of parental rights. You can see Bristol, 269, and they're as high as 443. So again, these are our kids being directly affected by this. And I'm just going to leave on this one. And then if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. But again, this is what we're seeing. So when we go to schools and we say, geez, we don't think we see these problems. Well, do you see an increase in grandparents coming in and registering their kids for school? Oh yeah, we see that. And what else do you see? Well, they're living with an aunt, or et cetera, et cetera. And so we don't want to stigmatize those kids at all. That's exactly what we want. We want to go the other way on this. But we also want to, raise them. So we do that thing, as I said, we want to raise the awareness. We want to take what resources we have and partner with as many people as we can. And we want to then prime the pump in terms of interventions, show people these are interventions that work. And then we want to try to do long-term policy work. And again, we're not interested in, our program's the best or any of that. It's going to be different in every community. I've worked in probably 50 communities. Every community it's going to be different in. And I tell people right away that the bottom line for me is it's not a program that's going to change a child's life. It's a relationship. And so that's what you have to think like. You have to think that small is the new big. If you keep trying to do this, we get into, great being the enemy of good. And sometimes you just got to get good going, and the other things will fall into place. So at that point, I'm looking at the clock, and I want to be cautious and mindful of your time. And I'm going to end right there, I hope.
Okay, thanks, Ed. So we're going to ask a couple of questions if anyone has any. I'll actually start if that's okay. So you spoke about children and schools specifically, and I know that there are other programs, organizations, leaders that may play a role in these programs as ACEs, such as peer mentoring, which I know that Fairwinds oversees. I'm basing this off of a video that I saw on the cdc.gov website that kind of explained it as well as you did. But it kind of gave me an idea that we're talking about store clerks, as you mentioned, bus drivers, really anyone within the community that you feel as though could have an impact on children's lives. And so could you maybe talk about what or whom in your experience should be a focus other than the school system?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we certainly want to focus on the school system first because, as someone said, there's a bank robber, I think, I'm not sure who it was, but Willie Sutton or something. Like, why do you rob the banks? Well, that's where the money is. Well, why do you work with the schools? Well, that's where the kids are. So we need to get to somebody who's got those kids for 8 hours a day. As we move down from that, we start to think about, are there little league coaches? Are there soccer coaches? Who are those people that they need to understand that they can be a major impact on a child's life? And they don't have to know everything, just have to have a little bit of empathy for what some kids may be going through. So when you see a child acting out, is that what, they don't have to even be, they don't have to have a ton of training, but have to raise their awareness of what may be going on. So again, as I said, we've done work with after school programs, YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs, hospital docs, missions, whoever has any contact with families or kids. Again, the first piece you want to do is just get people to raise the awareness. We got some pushback. Again, I told you about one of the programs in our community. It's a great program. They have a nice counseling center, but they said, oh, we have 2 groups, but we only have 1 group, and we're dealing with kids who witnessed trauma. And I'm like, okay, and that was 8. It's not enough. How do we get multiple? How do we, scale up? And how do we do that? And so, we want to put out there sometimes that and it's not always pleasant. Some people go, well, I don't think you want to talk about all that stuff, what's going on with kids in the community. We have one of those communities. I get it. At the same point, what we did for my own survival was I got as much data as I could, because that's what I used to show to people. And I would say, okay, so I got 1,500 kids on this list here, or 1,500 numbers. Do you want me to do nothing? I don't care if it's 1,500 or 15. Should we just do nothing? So the challenge is always, how do you get the word out to a number of places? So again, Chamber of Commerce, anybody who would listen to us, we're gonna get to. And again, surprisingly, the U.S. Attorney's Office in West Virginia, and we've had some conversation with Massachusetts as well, but West Virginia said this should be part of our strategy as well. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure if I.
It most certainly does. So for adverse childhood experiences, which is exactly what we're talking about, there was a key part regarding parents. Yep. And educating the parents on the signs to look for. And have you had any success in, instead of focusing on the children, focusing on parents or other grandmas or anything like that?
Yeah. So there's a tricky piece to this, and the tricky piece is that, let's say a parent is in recovery, great, but let's say now that we start to do some work with them, having them understand what ACEs is. Maybe it's part of their work, and people here who are in recovery are probably far more knowledgeable about this than I am, but maybe they want to understand the trauma in their life and how all that fits in. But at some point, and this is the tough part, parents make the connection. Oh my God, I have repeated what happened to me, and I've done it with my own children. So that's something we got to be. I don't think we shy away from it. It is what it is. But I think we got to be careful of how we approach that, because we don't want to re-stigmatize people or make them feel kind of like, oh, I've already screwed up my kid. Absolutely not. We kind of go from a strength-based approach. We're going from here forward. But I think the other piece is it's always good to get people who deal with kids to understand that, I think for a long time we had kids who acted out and we called them ADHD and we medicated, and I'm not sure that was the right thing. Certainly some kids benefit, many kids do, but I think it was kind of a catch-all. So I think the idea of how do we get everybody in that child's ecosphere to understand what's going on. And it may not be the individual child, because they're a child, as we said, there are kids who are going to fall beneath the radar. They're going to do that perfection thing. So that's where we really like the TLPI book, because we're talking about every child gets this. Every child gets a sympathic and caring adult. And the research is pretty clear. Nan Henderson and her resiliency study, the America's Promise, the Search Institute have done a lot of work on resiliency. And it's really those one or two caring adults in a child's life that can change the trajectory.
Right. Okay. Sue, do you want to see if anyone has their hand raised or any other questions?
Oh, I see Brian has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. Is in your communities that you've worked in, have you noticed that there is what is the types of things that you guys have tried to offer a family when maybe because of the drug use or whatever is going on in their lives or this child's lives, that there's a shelter problem or a homelessness problem? And in our community we don't have any shelters or homeless type things for homeless people. Right. So the only solutions is to send them off island, and now they're going to a place where they have no contacts or connections. What types of things what solutions have you been able to come up with for children in that situation?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because your island's so unique. I was actually thinking of that before, and I don't know if you have a school person on, but like, how do you deal with McKinney-Vento if you have a child who's from Nantucket, is homeless? The federal law of McKinney-Vento says you got to bring that child back to that school every day. So how do you deal with that? I don't know how you do that, but what we do is, so part of what we're doing is we're building relationships. We're telling kids about trying to build relationships for kids. We're building relationships with everybody. Homeless shelters. We have a contract that we work with the Family Center out of Old Colony United Way. That happens to be in Brockton, but they cover Plymouth County. I know Nantucket has a family center. It's funded by DCF. But they also get other funding streams. In this case, we have a grant from Office of Victims of Crime, and we pay that. So that's that solution. We also negotiate with the YMCA's Boys and Girls Club. Anybody who could help these kids, and what would it take for you to put something into the pot to help us? Is it a YMCA or Boys and Girls Club that says we'll give them free, we're going to give them free memberships or something? Or can we get a benefactor? Many times in some communities, they've had a benefactor who came in and said, you know what, this is really important. And it's important because I went through it, or my son went through it, or maybe they don't even have that lived experience, but they're like, I know this is the right thing to do, so let me help you write a check. And I think that's helpful as well. You have such a unique situation. I mean, I haven't had time to look at everything that's going on in Nantucket. I'm sure there's quite a bit, but you are probably one of the most unique places in Massachusetts in regards to how you address these issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize, Brian. I wish I could say, yeah, I got the magic potion right here and it's gonna go.
Yeah, it's just that I think unfortunately, because we are geographically isolated from other communities, and we
Sure.
do have young people or families that are just in such duress, and we don't have the resources to provide for them here on Nantucket. And then, we're just kind of like outsourcing the problem if we just try to send them off island somewhere, and often it's just not, practical or feasible, and you're removing them from the only, community that they know. But, as, Kevin would tell you, we don't really have any real resources for our homeless population, or when,
Is I'm sorry. Is there a youth development collaborative in Nantucket? Is anybody doing any youth development work at all?
In what specifically?
Also, I'll give you
general?
an example. In Plymouth, we have what's called Plymouth Youth Development, and the police sit down, very similar to what you're doing, but the police, the hospital sits down, youth serving agency, anybody who has anything to do with kids, and we probably get 40 people in the meeting. We do this in Brockton, we got it in Situate, we got it in a number of places, but I'll give you Plymouth would be a good example for you. And the focus is on what's going on with kids, both individually, the micro, and also the macro. Like, what are we doing? What's our philosophy? What's our strategy? What are we seeing with kids? So for instance, we were putting this together in regards to a drug-free community grant, right? We did that 15 years ago. It then evolves, and then some issue comes up. Vaping would be an example. Kids self-medicating, another example. The ACEs issue, another example. Getting in your work with William James. So it's how do we get a group of people to think about kids and put together a community-wide strategy?
Yeah.
Again,
So
we look to communities that care would be the three I would talk about, and we could have a further discussion on or offline. One is communities that care, and then the other one would be America's Promise, again, 5 promises, and the other one would be the Search Institute, the 40 developmental assets. That's what I think's got to happen. The community's got to say, okay, we've got enough of this outsourcing. It's probably easy for me to say, right? But I'd love to help you on it. But then how do we take and build a positive youth development in our community, so we don't have to outsource, which I would imagine creates a whole lot of stigma for everybody.
yeah, we don't do a lot of outsourcing per se,
Yeah.
but the school district as a whole does have a student support group that meets on a monthly basis to talk about issues that you've just brought up and others.
Mm-hmm.
Since the pandemic, I don't believe they have met
Yeah, that's tough, right?
or meet on a monthly basis, but maybe a quarterly basis. And then they have a smaller group that meets as well. But there is a group that does meet to discuss specifically youth and youth issues.
No, great. And then, so that's I would think that group would, and again, the last thing I'd say on that is data is really important. I think it helps make the argument. I think you've got a beginning, you've got a baseline, and then, because everyone talks about output versus outcome. Oh, we spent $1 million on this. That's output. What were the outcomes from it? Did you move the dial? Did you help kids? Did you raise reading levels? Did you decrease victimization? We're looking for outcomes. So the data is important to me because I want to know where we're going.
I would say, in addition to what the school's doing, and this is a group and I don't want to say infancy, but it's a group of nonprofits that have gotten together to do some programming for teens with the idea of having just some good, healthy activities for high
Sure.
school students to do, but also to kind of introduce them to these folks that are from the nonprofits with the idea that, who's your five? Who are the adults in your life that you can count on? And to kind of add more of those people into the lives of teenagers, because
Right.
the group that meets, we're not their boss, their coach, their teacher, their principal. Like we got nothing to hold over them. We're just
No
trying to
expectation,
produce
yeah.
programs. So I'm wondering if maybe we should merge those two groups at some point, just to kind of have the educational and the social emotional stuff merged
Yep.
together.
Yep. Relationships is, I can't say it enough. It's the key in macro and also in that micro.
Ed, this is
Yes, ma'am.
Jackie. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
My question, we dealt an awful lot about school age kids, but ACEs, a lot of very young children, infants and toddlers experience adverse things. How do you deal with them?
Yeah, well, so if you deal with them, I think, in my opinion, you got to deal with the family and the support system around them. It can't just be them, obviously.
Yeah.
So we have a program, some of you may be familiar with or heard of it. It's called To the Moon and Back. And it's a program that was started by a young woman named Teresa Harmon. This clinical social worker, her and her husband adopted a child who was NAS, neonatal abstinence syndrome. And the doctors and everyone told her, oh, it's not like fetal alcohol syndrome. Baby's going to be fine, natural development. She started saying, that's not what's happening. I'm seeing something different here. And again, maybe Facebook is good or bad, but she put it out on Facebook, and in 3 or 4 years, there's like 400 or 500 members, and they have chapters in a number of other states. So I think it has to be supporting the whole family, because you're obviously, if you got a 2 or 3 year old, what do you do in the context without the family? I don't know if you can do much. So my sense is I would be thinking about how do we support the family as well as the young child. I hope that makes some sense.
No, that makes sense to me. I guess what's brought that on, I've done a lot of research into Dr. Bruce Perry's work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Sure.
We've been using a lot of his stuff in a COVID survival series that we've been doing in conjunction with a psychiatrist who's on our board.
Yep.
And with Dr. Bruce Perry, he makes such a case for the amount of brain development that happens at a very, very young age, and how an adverse experience can affect the actual brain development of a 1 month old, 6 month old, year-old child.
Yeah, he talks about that neurosequential.
Yes, the neurosequential model.
And just as an aside, and I'll send it to you, maybe you have it, maybe you don't, but he's got a big keynote speak with Oprah Winfrey in like 3 weeks from now.
Yeah, I know.
Free. Yeah,
he works with Dr. Stuart Ablam from Mass.
Oh, sure.
Whom we've had down here on the Cape, and we've done a lot of
great. He's great.
Programming.
He's great.
And we had planned before COVID to have a conference where we'd have Bruce Perry and Ablam together on the Cape and on each island in order to give a one-day seminar.
Yeah. If you need somebody to pick them up at the airport, let me know.
Okay.
I'm your guy. I would like to have a conversation with him for an hour. I'm a big fan of his work. Matter of fact, it's the boy who was raised as a dog. I keep copies and give them to people all the time.
Well, we hope we'll still be able to do that once we kind of come out of COVID and I raise some more money. But he and Stuart Ablam are writing a book together also.
Oh, wow. Well, it's great. That's great.
Jericho, go ahead.
Oh. Yes, sir.
Hello. So earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned that there were a lot of cases where children with ACEs have been sort of misdiagnosed as other developmental issues. So, and you mentioned that one of the major distinguishing components of the behavior between those with ACEs and those with other ADHD, et cetera, was this perfectionism component of their behavior? Is that like a robust signal for distinguishing those kinds of cases? And is that also one of the better outreach points for educating people who would be interacting with ACE kids?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't want to, I think, you know, here's the issue, I guess, with the kid who's the perfectionist is, is everything really okay or is it not okay? And then how do you explore that with a child? What if everything is okay and you're kind of doing some exploration with a child? You're not seeing the behavior. So it's a tricky one, but I think we have to be careful that those kids don't get overlooked. But again, they're doing their best to kind of stay out of your eyesight in some ways. So again, I see it, and again, my opinion is I think we see it more in the child who's been traumatized than the child who has ADHD. I think the child who has ADHD is kind of out there, but I think the child is trying to keep that together. I mean, the perfectionist child has probably a greater ability of self-regulation based on their goal of staying below the radar. That'd be my assumption.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions for Ed?
I certainly appreciate your time, and I certainly appreciate the work you do. I know people don't always say thank you, but so from a kid from the city of Brockton, let me say thank you to you and the work you do. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ed, for joining us. Okay, great. And as I stated earlier, if you go to the CDC website, they have more information as well. We're going to have minutes taken, and I will make sure that we have Ed's contact information on the minutes if anyone has follow-up questions. I'm sure he'll be able to get back to you.
I'm sorry.